The forest makes no sound at 40 below zero. The wind has stopped. The air itself has become something else. Dense, crystalline, a substance that burns the lungs and turns breath into falling snow. In the darkness between the trees, frost builds on bark in geometric patterns, and the cold presses down like a physical weight. This is the reality of a Scandinavian winter in the deepest months. Not picturesque, not peaceful, lethal. And yet, 30 meters into this frozen forest, there is light. A low structure sits among the pines, barely visible under its burden of snow. Smoke rises from a hole in the roof, a thin column that seems impossibly fragile against the vastness of the cold. But inside those thick wooden walls, a family sits in warmth. Children sleep on benches lined with furs. A pot simmers over glowing coals. The temperature outside would kill an exposed human in less than an hour. Inside, it is warm enough to work with bare hands. This is a log cabin, not the romanticized version. The real thing, a structure built by people who understood that survival through a Nordic winter required more than hope and firewood. It required engineering. The difference between a pile of logs and a thermal fortress is knowledge. Knowledge of how wood breathes, how weight creates seal, how mass holds heat, how a building can work with cold instead of simply cowering behind walls. The Scandinavian log cabin wasn't primitive shelter. It was a sophisticated machine, refined over centuries, designed to turn the forest itself into protection against an environment that gave no second chances. Consider what it means for the sun to disappear. In the far north, winter begins not with a storm, but with an absence. The sun drops below the horizon in late November and does not return until January. This is the polar night, Kamos in Finnish, and it transforms the world into something fundamentally different from the long summer days. There is a brief twilight at midday, a pale grayness that barely distinguishes earth from sky, and then the darkness returns. For weeks, for months. The cold during this period is not the sharp, bright cold of a winter morning. It is deep, persistent, the kind of cold that finds moisture in wood and splits it, that makes metal brittle enough to shatter, that turns the landscape into a monochrome study in survival. Temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius were common across much of Scandinavia during the medieval warm period and earlier. In the inland forests and northern reaches, -40 degrees Celsius was not unusual. At this temperature, exposed skin begins to freeze in under 10 minutes. Frostbite sets in before you feel the warning pain. The air itself becomes a weapon, finding any gap in clothing, any crack in shelter, any weakness in construction. And then there is wind. The forests provided some protection, but the wind that moved through Scandinavia in winter was relentless. It didn't gust and fade. It blew steadily for days, driving the wind chill far below the actual temperature, searching out every seam and joint in a structure. A building that seemed solid in still air could become uninhabitable when the wind found its flaws. The cold became active, probing, testing. Snow accumulated in layers, sometimes reaching depths that buried the lower portions of buildings entirely. A roof had to support not just its own weight, but the crushing mass of wet, heavy snow that would settle and compact over the course of months. Weak construction meant collapse. A collapsed roof in January meant death. This was the environment, not a backdrop, not scenery, an active antagonist that would exploit every mistake, every shortcut, every moment of carelessness. The log cabin was the answer to this threat, but only when built by people who understood exactly what they were fighting. Before a single tree was felled, before the first notch was cut, the most critical decisions had already been made. Location was not a matter of convenience. It was strategy. The builders of these cabins understood that the environment itself could be weaponized or neutralized. A south-facing slope meant the difference between a home that caught precious winter sunlight and one that remained in perpetual shadow. During the short hours of weak daylight and deep winter, even indirect sun could raise interior temperatures by several degrees. That warmth was not luxury. It was the margin between survival and slow hypothermia. Wind was the second consideration. The prevailing winds in Scandinavia came from the northwest, cold air masses flowing down from the Arctic. A cabin built in an exposed clearing would face the full force of these winds for months, but a cabin positioned behind a natural windbreak, a granite outcropping, a dense stand of old-growth forest, the shoulder of a hill, created a zone of relative calm. The difference in wind exposure could cut heating requirements by nearly half. The builders chose their trees with the same calculated precision. Not just any timber would survive. The logs that formed these cabins came from slow-growth pine and spruce, trees that had spent decades growing in the same harsh conditions the cabin would face. A tree that grows slowly in cold soil develops tight, dense grain, wood that resists rot, holds its shape under stress, and crucially, insulates far better than fast-growth timber. The forest itself had already solved the problem of surviving Nordic winters. The builders simply harvested that solution. Diameter mattered. The massive logs used in traditional Scandinavian construction were not chosen for appearance. A log 12 to 16 inches thick provided thermal mass that thinner timber could not match. This mass would absorb heat from the central fire during the day and release it slowly through the night, stabilizing interior temperatures even as the outside air plunged to lethal depths. The wall itself became a battery, storing warmth. But before those logs could be stacked, the ground itself required preparation. Wood in direct contact with soil rots. Moisture wicks upward through the grain. Fungi colonize the damp fibers, and within years, the entire foundation weakens. The solution was deceptively simple. Raise the structure. The lowest logs of a Scandinavian cabin rested not on earth, but on carefully selected foundation stones. Flat, stable rocks positioned at intervals to support the weight, while creating a gap between timber and ground. This crawl space allowed air to circulate beneath the floor, keeping the wood dry. The entire structure could stand for generations, because this single detail prevented the slow rot that destroyed lesser buildings. These choices were made before construction began. They were made by people who understood that a cabin was not built in defiance of winter, but in conversation with it. The wall rose log by log, but this was not simple stacking. Each timber was a sculpted piece, shaped to lock into the one below it and the one that would rest above. The technique was called lafting, a word that carried centuries of refined knowledge in its 2 syllables. It began with selection, examining the natural taper and curve of each log, understanding how it would settle, where it would bear weight, how it would interact with its neighbors. No 2 logs were identical. Each required individual assessment. The builder would roll a fresh log into position atop the wall and scribe it, tracing the exact contour of the log beneath using a simple compass tool. This scribed line became the cutting guide. With axe and adze, the builder carved a shallow groove along the length of the upper log, creating a channel that would nest perfectly onto the curved surface below. When done correctly, the fit was so precise that light could not pass through the seam. But the true engineering happened at the corners. The interlocking corner joint, knutemring in Norwegian, knutar in Swedish, was the structural key that held everything together. Instead of simply crossing the logs at right angles, the builders cut deep notches that allowed each log to lock into the perpendicular timber. The notch was carved on the underside of each log end, creating a saddle that gripped the log crossing beneath it. As additional logs were stacked above, their weight pressed down on these joints, forcing them tighter together. The structure became stronger as it grew heavier. This was not accidental. The interlocking corner exploited gravity itself as a sealing mechanism. Fresh timber contained moisture. Green wood could be nearly half water by weight. As the logs dried over their first year, they would shrink slightly, settling into their notches with even greater force. The gaps that might exist in a nailed or pegged structure simply compressed closed. The corners became nearly airtight without caulking, without sealant, without any material beyond the wood itself. But nearly airtight was not sufficient. Between the logs, despite the scribed fit, small gaps remained, spaces where the natural irregularities of timber left openings for wind to penetrate. This was where the forest provided its second gift, sphagnum moss. The builders harvested it from bogs and wetlands, where it grew in thick carpets of pale green and rust red. This moss possessed properties that made it irreplaceable as chinking material. Sphagnum is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture from the air and expands. In the damp conditions common during Scandinavian summers and shoulder seasons, the moss packed between the logs would swell, filling every crevice, creating a living gasket that adjusted itself to the wood's movement. In dry winter air, it would contract slightly, but by then the logs themselves had swollen with interior moisture from cooking and breathing, maintaining the seal from the other direction. The moss also contained natural phenolic compounds that inhibited fungal growth and decay, a built-in preservative that kept both the moss and the adjacent wood from rotting. Some builders mixed the moss with clay, creating a plaster-like chinking that added thermal mass to the seal. The clay would dry into a hard matrix reinforced by the moss fibers, blocking wind while adding another layer of insulation. This mixture had to be applied carefully, packed firmly into the gaps from both sides, smoothed to shed water, maintained annually as the logs continued to settle. But when done properly, it transformed the wall from a stack of individual timbers into a unified thermal barrier. The result was a wall that functioned as a single massive unit, not hollow like modern frame construction, not layered like stone masonry, but solid wood 16 inches thick. This created thermal mass measured in tons. During the day, as the central fire burned, heat radiated into the logs. The dense, resinous wood absorbed this warmth slowly, the temperature gradient moving gradually from the interior surface toward the exterior. By the time the heat reached the outer face of the log, it was night, and the fire had burned low, and the stored warmth began its slow migration back inward. This thermal flywheel effect meant that interior temperatures remained relatively stable despite wild exterior swings. A fire that burned hot for 6 hours could keep the interior habitable for 16, because the walls themselves became radiators, releasing their stored energy through the long Arctic night. The building did not simply resist the cold, it managed time itself, storing summer in its logs and stretching each fire's warmth across the hours of darkness. The fire was not decoration, it was infrastructure. In the center of the cabin, a long hearth ran like a spine, not built against a wall, not tucked into a corner, but placed where its heat could radiate outward in every direction. This was the long fire, and its position was as calculated as every other element of the structure. A fire against a wall wastes half its heat, throwing it uselessly into stone or logs that face the exterior cold. A central fire becomes the sun of its own small system, warming everything in its orbit with equal generosity. The hearth itself was simple, a rectangle of flat stones set into the earthen floor, sometimes lined with clay to protect the ground beneath from the decades of heat it would endure. The fire burned long rather than tall, a bed of coals that could stretch 2 meters or more, with logs laid parallel rather than stacked in a pyramid. This created a broad, even heat source that could serve multiple purposes simultaneously, cooking at one end, metalwork at another, while the center provided pure warmth. Above, the roof opened. There was no chimney in the earliest cabins, no flue to channel smoke through an enclosed passage. Instead, a simple hole near the roof's peak allowed smoke to escape directly into the night. This seems wasteful, a portal for heat to pour out into the frozen air. But the system was more sophisticated than it appeared. Hot smoke rises with considerable force, creating a pressure differential that pulled fresh air into the cabin through small, deliberate gaps near the floor. These were not drafts in the modern sense, not cold blasts that swept across the room, but slow, steady currents that entered low, warmed as they moved across the floor and past the fire, then rose to exit through the roof hole. This created a continuous circulation without the sharp temperature gradients that make a space uninhabitable. The coldest air stayed at ground level, where thick layers of straw, rushes, and animal hides provided insulation underfoot. At sitting and sleeping height, the air was warm, kept in constant gentle motion by the thermal engine of the fire. The smoke itself contributed to this stability. The layer of warm smoke that accumulated near the ceiling acted as insulation, a gaseous blanket that trapped heat below it before finally escaping into the night. The smoke served another function. The interior of a log cabin was a smoked environment, and this was beneficial rather than merely tolerable. The creosote and other compounds in wood smoke are powerfully antimicrobial. As smoke permeated every surface, it impregnated the wood with natural preservatives, inhibiting the fungi and insects that would otherwise colonize the timber. The roof timbers, constantly bathed in smoke, became nearly immune to rot. Food hung from the rafters. Dried fish, cured meat, was simultaneously preserved and flavored by this environment. The cabin seasoned itself from the inside, becoming more durable with each passing year. But smoke and heat could only be managed if cold air was prevented from flooding in through larger openings. Windows were the enemy of warmth. Glass was rare to non-existent in early Scandinavia, and even when available, it was expensive and fragile. A window was a hole in the thermal barrier, a place where precious heat met freezing air with only a thin membrane between them. The solution was to minimize them almost to extinction. The windows that did exist were small, often no larger than a handspan, and covered not with glass, but with translucent animal membrane. A cleaned, stretched piece of intestine or stomach lining, scraped thin and oiled, would allow diffuse light to enter while blocking wind. In the dimmest months, when the sun barely rose, these windows admitted almost no useful light, but they prevented the alternative. A sealed box of permanent darkness, or a drafty hole that made the interior uninhabitable. Doors were kept low and narrow. A door is a weak point in any structure, a place where seals are never perfect, and cold air waits to rush in with every opening. By making the door small, builders reduced the volume of cold air that could enter when someone passed through. The door itself was thick timber, sometimes double-layered, hung on wooden or iron hinges that allowed it to seal tightly against the frame. In the deepest winter, a heavy hide or woven textile was often hung just inside the door, creating an airlock effect, a dead airspace that buffered the interior from the momentary blast of Arctic air when the door swung open. Every opening was a calculated compromise between the need for access and the imperative to contain heat. The cabin was not sealed like a modern insulated structure. It breathed, slowly and deliberately, through the controlled gaps that managed smoke and brought in oxygen. But it did not leak. The difference is subtle but critical. A leaky building loses heat constantly, through uncontrolled drafts. A breathing building manages airflow, using pressure differentials and thermal dynamics to create livable conditions without squandering warmth. The fire burned day and night through the winter months, fed carefully to maintain a bed of coals that never went fully cold. Letting a fire die meant hours of brutal cold while attempting to restart it with friction or preserved embers, a risk no one took lightly. The long fire was tended in shifts, a responsibility that rotated through the household, because the fire's life was the household's life. As long as it burned, the logs radiated their stored warmth. The smoke rose steadily through the roof hole, and the interior remained a pocket of warmth suspended in the frozen darkness outside. The cabin in deep winter was not silent. Livestock shuffled in the attached byre, their breath adding moisture to the air. A loom creaked as someone worked wool into fabric. Children murmured near the fire. Outside, the wind might howl or the forest might stand in frozen silence. But inside this log-walled world, life continued with deliberate rhythm. The floor was never bare wood or raw earth. Layers of insulation built up underfoot. First rushes or straw laid thick across the ground, then animal hides where people walked and sat most frequently. This wasn't comfort. It was thermal management. Cold air settles. Without insulation below, the chill rising from the earth would make the space uninhabitable despite the fire above. The layered floor created a barrier, trapping still air in the straw's matrix, keeping the cold beneath where it could do no harm. Along the walls, wide benches served as the primary furniture. During the day, people sat here to work, carving, sewing, preparing food, repairing tools. At night, these same benches became beds, with furs and woven blankets piled on for warmth. Sleeping arrangements were communal not by choice, but by necessity. Bodies clustered together shared heat. The very young and very old slept nearest the fire. This wasn't intimacy in the modern sense. It was physics. In many structures, the livestock lived not in a separate building, but in an attached section divided by a low wall or partition. Cattle, goats, sheep, their body heat was too valuable to waste. A single cow produces as much heat as a small stove simply through metabolism. In a well-insulated space, several animals could raise the ambient temperature by 5 degrees or more. The smell was considerable, the noise constant, but the warmth was necessary, and the arrangement meant that valuable animals were protected from predators and theft while serving as living radiators. The air was thick, smoky from the fire, humid from breath and cooking, heavy with the scent of wool, animals, food, unwashed bodies living in close quarters for months. Modern sensibilities would find it nearly unbearable. But this environment was stable. The smoke seasoned the timber. The humidity prevented the wood from drying out and cracking. The warmth preserved life. Winter was when the culture reproduced itself. The sagas were told here around these fires, passed from memory to memory in the long, dark hours. Tools were crafted with the patience that winter enforced. No rushing to the fields, no urgent harvests, just the slow work of hands shaping wood and bone and metal. Textiles were woven, not as decoration, but as insulation for the next winter. Every task served survival, either immediate or future. The cabin was an ecosystem, self-contained, self-regulating. A pocket of managed warmth and air and light carved out of an environment that permitted none of those things naturally. And when spring finally broke, when the sun returned and the snow began its long melt, the cabin had done its work. The family emerged intact. The livestock survived. The culture persisted. The logs stood ready for the next siege.